We're just gonna wait a couple more minutes and let everyone kind of get into the meeting, and then we'll go ahead and start. Um, just a few housekeeping things before we get started, and while we wait for other folks, is if everyone could please just keep themselves muted throughout the presentation today. And if you have any questions, you can go ahead and use the Zoom chat function, or if you're on Facebook, you can use the comment section, and then we can address those questions at the end of the presentation. All right, and then this tour is being streamed live and recorded on our Facebook page, and we record all of our lectures. So each week, if you'd like to go back and watch any of our previous lectures, you can always access those on our Facebook page 24/7. So that's a nice thing that we have. And it looks like it's 11 o'clock, and I don't see any more people coming in, so I guess we can go ahead and get started. So today we have the Baroque in Spain by our docent, Karen. And here we go, Karen, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and Scott, too, our wonderful hosts. Without them, these lectures would not be possible. I do want to just let everybody know that we are taking off November and December. My next lecture was scheduled right on Thanksgiving, and obviously that's not going to work for anybody. And then the December lecture, again, fourth Thursday of the month, tends to be too close to Christmas. So I will be taking off November and December, but I'll start again the fourth Thursday in January, and we'll have some new lectures, and I'm really excited about that. So, welcome everyone to the Spanish Baroque. The Spanish Baroque is so unique. I mean, just looking at this painting, you can tell there's quite a difference from the Dutch and Flemish still lifes of the Baroque or the Italian Baroque, but of course, there were influences across the way. We're looking right now at a magnificent painting, and we are going to talk at length about it. It is by the great Sevilla artist Zurbarán, Francisco de Zurbarán. And we do have a Zurbarán, so beautiful Zurbarán, in the Timken collection, which again, I will be talking about. It's probably a really good thing that we did review Mannerist painting last time, because there's always these segues, and we're going to look at some Renaissance painting in Spain, and we're going to look at the work of El Greco, because El Greco still maintained that Mannerist tradition that was begun by Michelangelo. And El Greco actually lived a little more into the Renaissance and the very early Baroque. But the Spanish artists did move away from that very specialized Mannerist tradition. Now, remember when we look at Parmigianino, Pontormo, Michelangelo, Veronese, we look at how in many of their paintings, there was unique style, elongated necks, hyperextended limbs, everything kind of in motion. And you're not going to see so much of that with these Spanish painters. So the Baroque in Spain was a response to the idealization in Spanish painting and the distortions. It was an intellectual movement, Mannerism. So not to say that there isn't intellectualism involved, but this is more realistic. Let's take a look at what we see and duplicate it. And also the Catholic Church, particularly in light of the Reformation, wanted to make sure that viewers looked at these beautiful paintings and understood what was happening, what was the significance, the biblical story, the religious stories. They didn't want any confusion. So therefore, they encouraged the artists, the Spanish church, that is the Catholic Church, to focus more on realism. Who were the big patrons? The Habsburgs. We're going to look at paintings that were inspired by Philip II and Philip IV, not quite as much Philip III. Philip IV, who was the great patron of Velasquez, for example, and Zurbarán, was a great art collector. and he was building palaces and lodges and wanted art for them. But also the Catholic Church, as I mentioned, was putting in many new altarpieces, polyptychs, triptychs, saints in the churches. The emerging style was very influenced by not only Caravaggio, who lived from 1571 to 1610, but also artists like Peter Paul Rubens, because the Habsburgs controlled not only the Flemish region, the Netherlandish region, until the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, but they also had artists like Peter Paul Rubens, who was Flemish from Antwerp, coming in to Spain, and so there was this cross-pollination. Also, artists like El Greco were very influenced by Venetian painting, particularly the Venetian Renaissance, Tintoretto, Titian, for example. So they are not in isolation. When you start to look at some of these artists, you can see definitely the influence of the Flemish painters and the Italian painters. So the reign of, I'm going to talk just a minute or two more, kind of set the stage, and then we'll begin to look at some of the paintings. The reign of Philip IV, which you'll see many paintings from his reign, they called him the Planet King. He was remembered for his patronage of the arts. He was King of Spain from 1621 to 1665. He was a great patron of the arts. However, what is happening in Spain is changing. In the beginning of the 17th century, the early part of the 1600s, Spain was a powerhouse. They were exploring, they were colonizing, they had a very strong military. But as things began to change, things began to wane. For example, they lost Portugal, I believe, 1621. There was a lot of money being poured into the colonies. There was wars going on and battles. So with England, with the Netherlands, so there was a lot of decline. However, that's not to say that there wasn't great art produced. So the Habsburgs and the Catholic Church promoted some really beautiful, somber, somewhat gloomy paintings that definitely resonate with the viewers. And lastly, I'll just say that the end of the century brought the end of the Habsburg era. And the Habsburgs there were Austrian Habsburgs and Spanish Habsburgs. Remember, the Flemish region was controlled. But the Counter Reformation, which literally begins in the Reformation, 1517, with the edicts by Martin Luther on the door of the church 95 Thesis, we see a move away from pure Catholicism in the north with people like John Calvin. We begin to see that Martin Luther, of course, that the Spanish stylistic is going to be very regional. All right, so let's move on to begin. When we look at some of the Counter-Reformation paintings, I will talk to you about them specifically because I want to explore why the iconography, the imagery is so deeply Catholic. Part of it, I guess, is that they want to make sure that people stay connected to the Catholic Church and maybe don't move away from these Protestant sects. All right. So Juan de Flanders is not his name. We're going to go with this. This is what he was called. But he was a Flemish painter from Ghent. And I'm bringing, this is Renaissance. Look at the dates. This is actually, right in the Renaissance, about the time that Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa. We have artists that are cross-pollinating. So we have Juan de Flanders, and he trained in Ghent, as I mentioned. He was very much influenced by the great Hugo van der Goes. But he began to be connected toward the end of his career. He began to be connected with one of the monarchs in Spain, Isabella of Castile. And he began to do portraits for her and panels and polyptychs. And so after the queen died, he was still in Spain, and he was in Salamanca, for example, where the great university is, and he began to paint Spanish subjects. So he used refined colors, a very distinct style, and it has become sort of the segue into the deep Spanish Baroque. A little bit later on, I'm going to talk to you about light, because realism, light is prominent in Spanish painting. And we move away from just chiaroscuro, which I'm going to show you, and move into what's called tenebrism, which is very Spanish. But suffice to say, we do see a little chiaroscuro here. There's a little bit of light on the faces. But what is happening? So let's talk about the marriage feast of Cana. This is where Christ is said to create the first miracle. He was at a wedding and there was no more wine, and he turned the water to wine. And what do we have? This is one of 47 panels representing the lives of Christ and the Virgin Mary. And we see this wedding. And so we have Christ here. Hopefully my cursor works. We have Christ here in prayer with a nun. And then we see two figures here. So this is John the Evangelist and his bride, Mary Magdalene, representing really the royal family. So we have two religious figures, but in essence, they're probably members of the royal family. Then we have this unique character here too, and he seems to be peering into this beautiful loggia, and it is actually a portrait of Juan de Flanders. Kind of interesting. This is a beautiful architectural space, quite unique. And you can see this development of not only landscape here, but still life as well, and these beautiful vessels. I want to talk to you just really quickly about this mirror. You're going to see the use of a mirror in the painting Las Meninas by Velasquez, one of the greatest masterpieces of the 17th century. But it's interesting that we have this beautiful mirror here. And if you look closely, you can actually see, it looks like a little forest of these spindly trees and a pathway. Where did this come from? Well, suffice to say, he might have seen the work, and it's most likely he saw the work of Jan van Eyck in the marriage portrait of Olofini. So this use of a mirror, very technically difficult and very remarkable. All right, so we'll go on and we'll look at one more painting by this Flemish painter who worked in Spain, and this is the Baptism of Christ. And here we have Christ in the Jordan River with a magnificent landscape behind, and John the Baptist is obviously baptizing him. And it confirms his ministry. He's now going to be able to proselytize. And we have an angel here holding a robe and this beautiful water with the Jordan River with the fish. And then we have the Holy Spirit, and it represents the Christian soul. And then Christ above as Pantocrator, or, omnipresent, holding a crucifix and a glass orb, and that means Salvator Mundi, savior of the world. So the colors are quite unique, very different from what we're going to see as we go really into the Baroque and leave the Renaissance behind. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the early Baroque painters in Spain, and this is Francesco Ribalta. And this is a painting, Madonna and Child with Music Making Angels. Let's talk a little bit about Ribalta. He lived from 1565 to 1628. He trained in Toledo and was born in a part of Catalonia. The four cities that were very prominent in Spanish Baroque painting were obviously Madrid, Sevilla, Toledo, and Valencia. But that is not to say that artists weren't painting in, for example, in Salamanca, which I mentioned because that was a great university town. In fact, I remember as a young woman visiting Salamanca. It's not too far from Madrid, and being in a classroom. It's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, universities in Europe, and standing at a lectern where Galileo actually, in the early part of the 17th century, actually lectured. So he was one of the followers of Ribalta, of this austere tenebrous style. So what is tenebrism, and what is chiaroscuro, and what is sfumato? Tenebrism is more likely seen in Spanish painting, and that is when almost all the details in the background disappear into inky blackness. Chiaroscuro is more when light falls on a figure and creates depth. And we see chiaroscuro here as the light comes from the left and it falls on the beautiful Madonna and Child. He had seen the work of Caravaggio. Many of these artists were very influenced by Caravaggio because, in essence, Naples was controlled by the Habsburgs at this time. And so some of these artists, for example, Ribalta, went into Naples and probably Rome too, and visited, saw the work of Caravaggio, who was didn't live much past this time. So Madonna and Child with Angels is a beautiful horizontal composition, and it's quite different. Usually we see more vertical, but here we have the Madonna is holding very tightly, pardon me, the Christ child, who puts his foot on an orb, and again, that Salvator Mundi, savior of the world, and holds a mini, a cross, long elongated cross. And then we have an angel playing the lute, and then we have an angel also playing a musical instrument on the right. And so this is a very, she's actually playing a lute on the right. And then we see them in kind of in rapture as they watch the little tiny cup of the Madonna and Child, closely held, very, very beautiful, and also very loving. All right, so this really is more of his style. This is where we have tenebrism. So what we have is light falls on Saint Bernard, but it also falls on the chest of Christ. So we have, and the background is very hard to distinguish. But sometimes when we start talking, what is this tenebrism? Is this chiaroscuro? Sometimes it's a little hard to differentiate, and some it's very obvious, and some it's a little bit different. So Ribalto's Christ Embracing Saint Bernard. He was really the first Spanish artist to completely abandon Mannerism. He wanted to create a more realistic style. And he was from Catalonia, and he trained in Toledo. He was definitely influenced by Caravaggio, but he had this kind of virile naturalism. What do I mean by virile naturalism? Look how the body of Christ is very three-dimensional, very sculptural. You can see the sinewy in the arms, the musculature, the shadows as it falls on the knees. And look at how, as he descends from the cross, this light and dark, the rapture of Saint Bernard, he's actually holding up Saint Bernard. Christ himself, he was coming down from the crucifixion, but he's actually, from the cross, I should say, he's actually embraces and holds St. Bernard up. And St. Bernard, who was an abbot, a mystic, he was French, part of the Knights of Templar, the French Crusaders. He also modified the Benedictines, but his face is beatific. Light shines on him. He's almost in a half smile. It's a very profound religious depiction. You feel this prominent face and cheekbones, and he's held with such rapture that it's just exquisite. And so, but what's very interesting, we have this hyper realism, hyper detail, but then again, we have these servants, and they are not distinguished. It's very hard to see their facial features. They're sort of generalized, and so you see the difference of the reality of these two figures, and then sort of the blurring of the saints. All right, so we're going to go to the next painter who was very much influenced by Ribalto, and his name was Giuseppe de Ribera. And Ribera did train. They lived in the same area near Valencia. So he came to Italy about 1608, 1609, and this is through Naples. And again, I said Naples was controlled by the Habsburgs. It was the Spanish viceroys who controlled it. And then eventually went into Rome and Lombardy. He studied the great masters of Italy. He loved the high Renaissance work of Raphael, for example. And he uses a lot of sharp chiaroscuro and tenebrism in his work. There's a lot of luminosity. He begins to expand his use of color, because one thing about the Spanish Baroque, different from the, pardon me, excuse me, Italian Baroque, is there isn't this use of the bright, vivid colors. There's drama, there's action, but it's much more monochromatic. Look at this. This is tonalities of gray, brown, dark green with a little bit of a red. So this is very, very Spanish. He did begin to bring some color in, but basically he was a Spanish painter who spent a lot of his time in Italy. So, but he did train in Spain, and he did paint some Spanish for the Spanish court. All right, pardon me. Let's look at the martyrdom of Saint Bartholomew. So Saint Bartholomew was one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, and just for point of fact, we have a magnificent masterpiece in the Timkin, and that is our very own Rembrandt. the portrait of Saint Bartholomew. So he was flayed alive for his beliefs, meaning skinned, obviously. And we know that because we see an element of torture here. We have his executioner holds a knife, and it's like he's getting it nice and sharp. So he's sharpening the knife, and we have some figures here in on the scene, and it appears that there's a skull with a hood, kind of creepy. And then we have Saint Bartholomew with outstretched arms. He's almost piercing the canvas. And we have, pardon me, his arms. He's tied to a pole with rope, and he's pulled taut. But there is so much rapture and spirituality in this painting. His eyes are open. He looks to a heavenly light. And I would say this is use of tenebrism because of the space is not delineated, and we have just this inky black, but there is chiaroscuro that falls on this face. Now, the executioner has this intense feeling too, and it might be that he too might want to convert. So it's a very psychologically charged painting and quite magnificent. All right. So one thing that many of these artists learned from Caravaggio, if you look at Caravaggio's Bacchus, for example, you see this interest in painting, and this is very true in Spain, this interest in painting people of a different lower class, so to speak, peasants and people in poverty, and, you know, just different ages, not just beautiful young aristocrats, but people of all walks of life. And where did this come from? Well, it was part of this deep Christian faith to depict people in suffering. Part of it also, as I said, looking at the work of Caravaggio. And Ribera was in Sevilla when he painted this, and it was in Naples when he painted it. And it was commissioned by a Flemish patron. But the boy was probably most likely relating to what was going on in Sevilla, because in Sevilla, we have the plague, we have a lot of poverty, we have a lot of poor people living there. So it was a region where a lot of difficult things were going on. And so let's talk really specifically about this young boy. So he has a club foot. You can see his foot is a little bit twisted, and he holds a note in his hand written in Latin. And basically what it's saying is, for the love of God, give me alms, ALMS. And so he's begging, and there's an indication that he might be not only crippled, but also mute. And then he's holding a jacket, and then we have this clever use of his crutch. It's jauntily over his shoulder, it's kind of, and he smiles at us with this sort of bad teeth, gap tooth and everything. But it does show the Christian awareness of human suffering and weakness with a little bit of humor, even though at this time, Ribera was close to the end of his life and he was having, a lot of difficulties. Still, he was able to capture this with quite a nice landscape in the background. All right, El Greco. Everybody knows the work of El Greco. It's so unique. What a genius. El Greco is the Greek. He was actually from the island of Crete, and he painted Byzantine icons. We can actually look at this painting, the Disrobing of Christ, and I'll talk about that specifically in a minute. It actually looks like a Byzantine icon, the facial characteristics. So he definitely expressed Counter Reformation. In other words, the Reformation was the development of Protestant sects throughout Europe, particularly the North, as I mentioned. Holland really becomes a Protestant nation. But at this time, the Protestant Reformation is occurring, and the Spanish church wants people to stay connected to Catholicism, and they set out for the Counter Reformation. That is almost like a propaganda campaign to really explore how to keep people connected. And if you visually are inspired, you might stay a Catholic. So they wrote all kinds of treatises and had paintings done in order to really expand and develop and control the Catholic Church. So he moved to he was very influenced. He spent some time probably in Venice, but he was very influenced by the Spanish, pardon me, the Venetian painters, as I mentioned, Tintoretto, Titian. So that was that influence. But he does still retain that Mannerist tradition with the elongated figures, kind of hypernatural. Some people say, oh, he painted this way because he had eye issues, astigmatism. That's kind of been discounted. That probably isn't the case. It's his own interpretation and vision. So this was painted, this roping of Christ was painted for Toledo Cathedral because he spent most of his career in Toledo. And it's the moment when Christ is in Calvary and he's ascended to Calvary and he's being stripped of his clothes before the crucifixion. So this beatific Christ in the center with his scarlet robe, and he sees he's being tormented, but he seems also to be oblivious. He's looking up, spiritually connected, and all these tormentors are hovering around him. And we see people in military garb, one on the left, and this great ensemble here, beautiful metal, we have this exquisite Spanish style. We have someone ready to just tighten the noose in this green jacket. He's also, one of them is trying to steal right here the cloth right off of Jesus, take his clothes. And then we have a man in black behind him just tormenting him here, just tormenting him. And then we have the three Marys down here. And then we have a fellow in the foreground, and he's drilling a hole in order to have the nails be secure. So the rope is being taut, and it's very, very unusual scene, and the coloration is just magnificent. All right. So the greatest work by El Greco, many of his works, I said, were done in Toledo. This is considered his finest work. And I apologize because I wish the painting could be much larger, so we'll have to look a little more closely. It's divided into two sections, the burial of Count Orgaz. Now, what is the story? The story comes from the early part of the 14th century, and there was a count, and he was from the last line of Byzantine nobility, and he wanted to give a lot of money to the church in which El Greco worshipped. And he gave so much money to this church that he was considered like, he was a count, but almost like a saint, a very pious man. And so when he dies in the 14th century, two saints come down from the heavens, St. Augustine on the left and St. Stephen on the right, to bury him with their hands. They don't want to just have anybody bury him. They come down from heaven to bury him. And so it's divided between the spiritual world and the temporal world. And we have everybody from El Greco's son, who's in the foreground, to all these grandees, these Spanish political figures and aristocrats. And he does these very careful portraits of them because they were really responsible. And some of these are actual portraits of people who lived at that time, who were very responsible for supporting the city of Toledo. So what do we have here? We have an angel, literally like a baby, carrying the soul of the count. So it's right here, and she ascends, or he ascends. And then we have two figures here who are kind of stressing the importance of the veneration of Jesus. And so the soul is being brought up to Mary and St. John, and we have Jesus right here. And it's kind of like this swirling cloud of gossamer. It's very otherworldly. It's swirling. It's light infused. We have chiaroscuro here, a little bit on these faces. So it is remarkable in coloration, in detail, in concept. And we definitely see that in Spain. We often have the bringing together of the spiritual world and the temporal world. And we'll see that a little bit more when we look at still life painting. Now, this painting, I'm just going to talk about just for a second, and it's called the opening of the fifth seal. So there were 7 seals in this book of judgment. And in this case, it is the vision of St. John, and he's with his arms in the left. And unfortunately, it was found that this painting was cut. And the top, they think, had a throne with God or other figures. But this definitely was, painting was cut. They think it was a throne. And you have a very elongated St. John, his head turns, and he's raising, imploring God. And behind him are 2 groups of figures. And they represent people who have been, let's say, crucified or dealt with in a very negative way, and they've done nothing wrong. And so by opening the 5th seal, we determine who is to be judged, who was judged incorrectly, and who should be given salvation. And so we have the figures here on the right are given these white cloths, and that indicates salvation in a sense. And they cry out for justice. Hey, we were martyred, we did nothing wrong, and we were condemned, and now we want to be wrapped in the cloak of righteousness. And so that we have this here. So again, very manneristic, interesting coloration, imploring figure, very spiritual. All right, so because of time, I'm going to move on, and we're going to go to the last painting by El Greco. Actually, no, we'll move on to Cotán. I think you'll find his work just as remarkable as I do. Now, if you visit the San Diego Museum of Art, you will be able to see this exquisite masterpiece. And I really hope you have seen it. So Juan Sánchez de Cotán, who lived from 1516 to about 1627, he was a pioneer of realism. And he spent most of his life, he was born near Toledo, but he spent a lot of his life as a Carthusian monk. He had a workshop in Toledo. He painted for sort of the grandees in the church and so forth. But eventually, after 20 years, he closed up his studio and he became involved with a religious order. He continued to paint religious themes. He moved away from portraits and still lifes once he became a Carthusian. But look at this absolutely exquisite still life painting. And as I mentioned earlier, these still life painters in Spain were quite different than the Italian or Dutch Flemish still life painters. When you think about, let's say, some of the Dutch still life painters, Willem Kalf, for example, they're these beautiful, floral, exquisite objects, very lush and layered. We don't find that in Spanish Baroque painting. I'm just awed by this exquisite image. So what do we have here? We have a quince, a cabbage, a melon, and a cucumber. And it's almost set in a window ledge like an altar. And look at the tenebrism here. There's nothing in the background. It's inky black. And what he is suggesting is that this is like an altar between the spiritual world and the everyday world. And you're almost like right at the point of connection. Why are these fruits and vegetables hanging? Well, as I told you, in this bodegon or bodegones, that's the name of these type of still life paintings in Spain. And how they were unique is that they did pantry items rather than, let's say, lush floral arrangements, again, that you would find in the Dutch Flemish and Italian. They were hanging because of spoilage. And I've told you this a couple times before, but if you haven't heard, and I'll repeat it really quickly, I lived in Spain as a young woman and in a town called Zamora, very like a Renaissance town. The building I lived in was like from the 16th century. It was so old. There was no hot water. There's no refrigeration. And I was told by some of the townspeople, hang up your fruit because it will not touch and it will be less likely to be infected with insects. So that is part of this. And look at the light, the realism, the beauty. This also relates to planetary exploration. Now, Galileo studied the planets with a telescope, which he did not invent, helped to perfect by 1609. And this was done about 7 years before. But that isn't to say that there wasn't some planetary interest and exploration. So it could be that this painting relates to that. One other thing is there was a mathematical concept called Archimedes' hyperbola, and it deals with the curvature of an object. So some people would suggest that this sliced melon with the light falling on the section was a relationship to this. Now, Cotán was very intellectual, and his patrons, before it was just a church, were very educated, intellectuals, smart, and sophisticated. And so you get that sense of sophistication in his paintings. We'll show you one more. And this one is kind of interesting. So another Bodegón painting from a pantry, very realistic. Look how the birds hang. And it's kind of funny because he duplicates or replicates what we just saw in the previous painting, the quince, the cabbage, and the melon. He adds another vegetable here, like a squash. Now, what's so ironic about this painting is that when he became a Carthusian and they're devoted to poverty and prayer, it was very funny that he had fowl because they didn't eat meat. So just a little sidebar, because he really was a very vegetarian and became a vegetarian. All right, so we're going to go to probably the greatest artist of the 17th century in Spain, and that is Diego Velázquez. And Velázquez lived from 1599 to 1660. He was a leader of the Spanish school of painting, and he began in Sevilla. His family, pardon me, were the lower nobility, and he studied with a great man called Francesco Pacheco. And Pacheco was his teacher, a teacher of a couple other really famous artists. But by 1623, when he was 24 years old, he was already appointed to be painter for Philip IV. So as I mentioned, Philip IV was a great patron of arts, but by the time Philip was a patron, they were building, they had already built Escorial, that was under Philip II, the great magnificent palace complex with hospitals and libraries. And he was also, that had already been commissioned by Philip II, but Buen Retiro, which is outside of Madrid, and a hunting lodge was built by Philip IV, and he definitely wanted it filled with the great art of people like Velázquez, for example. What Velázquez did that's different from his colleagues, other artists, is he uses a more gestural brushstroke, not as tight. His coloration is a little more fluid and open, and his use of light is non-pareil. So he also did go to Italy, and he did know the work of Caravaggio, but he also learned a little bit about the use of different pigments, and you can see that here. Okay, so here we have a woman cooking eggs, and it's kind of funny. The title of the painting is Woman Frying Eggs. Funny because she's not frying the eggs, she's boiling them. So they sometimes they want to change it, but I don't think it's really that important. Well, let's talk about the light a little bit. Why would this be considered chiaroscuro and not tenebrism? It's considered chiaroscuro because even though he used a very inky black background, you can still see the basket hanging and the utensils that the woman would use. So there's a little bit of a different kind of dimensionality to it. He so carefully renders in still life this beautiful earthenware pitcher. We have the onions and mortar and pestle, and we have these lovely eggs. And she holds an egg and she's about to scoop it. And this young boy is helping her, and he's holding a gourd. And the light shines on her face. The light does come from the left, and it also falls on the little servant boy. The one thing that is interesting about this painting, too, is that he uses some of the same characters. So this woman, you would find her face in more than one painting, actually, in some of his other paintings. And so again, just to clarify, chiaroscuro is the focus on high contrast is very much used in Italy. It helps to show the definition of objects and subjects, clearly lit backgrounds. Tenebrism is more obscures the background. and obscure significant details. And then we have sfumato. And Leonardo used sfumato so brilliantly in the Mona Lisa, but sfumato would be here. It's usually smokiness, and you see it just around the eyes. So this is this wonderful painting. All right, just quickly, I want to talk about this Rendo Breda. And here we have, it's kind of unique, this painting done in the 1630s. And it was to decorate a massive palace that was to build outside of Madrid. I mentioned Buen Retiro. And he wanted to just fill it with art. And so Philip was just amasses a very impressive collection. And we'll talk about it just a minute when we look at Las Meninas. So what's happening here? Okay, Breda. What is Breda? Where is Breda? Breda is on the border of today Holland and Belgium. And you might know of Breda because the very great Peter Bruegel the Elder, his family was from Breda. And it's kind of on the Dutch border. And Peter Bruegel, as a high Renaissance painter, did a lot of Christian and Catholic subjects. So there was this Protestant Catholic ethos, but it does show that there was a lot of conflict in this area because of the Reformation. And so there was kind of a winning of the battle by the Spaniards. So in 1625, we have this winning of this kind of battle, and we have Nassau and Commander Nassau, and he's of the Dutch forces, and he's handing the keys to the Spanish, who's actually an Italian general, Spinola, and he's saying, okay, I give up. You people took over this Dutch area that wants to be Protestant, because this is during the Protestant Reformation, and I lost. And Spinola kind of pats him on the head, a little pejorative, a little condescending, but he bows to him, gives the key to the city back to the Spanish. That part is fictionalized. That part didn't happen, but there was a battle and the Spanish did win. If you look at the Dutch forces, they look beleaguered. You know, there's tattered clothing, a plume here, but they don't look like they're in the best shape. And there's some smoke from maybe weaponry. And then we look at over the Spanish group, and they look very together, much better dressed, so to speak. And then you have all these spears that are high and show their success. And then, of course, this beautiful animal. So this commemorates a battle. And so we're going to do a couple more of Velasquez because such an important artist. So let's look at this painting of one of the Habsburg monarchs. This happens to be Philip IV. So you know that the Habsburgs were very intermarried. They often married cousins and so forth. Why? To preserve this dynasty that extends into Austria and other places. And I bring that up because I just want you to look at this lantern jaw. The Habsburgs did have these kind of lantern jawed, and it's very, it was just because of the interbreeding, so to speak. You would see this frequently on these Habsburg members of the court, particularly the males. Okay, so let's just talk about this painting of Philip. Velasquez spent most of his career working for Philip IV. He was the official court painter. He accompanied Philip not only in the palaces, but on expeditions, you know, to document, as it were. And so the king, was in the province of Catalonia, where there was some skirmishes. They were trying to break away, and he goes to be the great general. So he's not wearing the typical black ensemble that you might see, but you see this exquisite, embellished red garment. He's holding a very, a very prominent hat. And then he holds like a baton, a general's baton. And then we have all kinds of jewelry and exquisite clothing and this lace. So he looks at us with this brocade ensemble, very, very secure and very proud. All right. Probably one of the most important paintings in the Baroque in Spain is Las Meninas, the little handmaidens. So the 5-year-old Infanta Margarita is being painted, and her whole sort of entourage, not whole, but many members of her entourage plus her parents are all in this. And some people would say it's kind of like a royal genre painting. And what do we have? We have Velasquez here, And he's painting right here. We don't even know exactly what he's painting. Is he painting the Infanta or not? Her parents are here in this beautiful mirror watching. Where are they standing? We're not quite sure. Remember what I told you in one of the earlier paintings, Juan de Flanders, sorry, that these mirrors appear, and it's so obvious that he was influenced by Jan van Eyck and his marriage portrait. We know that Philip was a great art connoisseur. We even see some of his paintings. We have a doctor who was a relative of Velasquez, one of the Velasquez family members. He's here in the doorway watching. And then we have, and I don't know if it's the correct term, they call them dwarfs, a little person, and we have a Spanish and Italian members of the retinue of the young princess, and one of her servants is handing her some tea or liquid or coffee or chocolate, we don't really know. And we see this little boy and he's stepping on the dog. So all kinds of things are happening, but you don't see that tight brushstroke. We see realism, we see beautiful light as it falls on the princess, but just the use of space, the originality, is just a most amazing painting. All right, I do want to go a little more quickly, and this is a masterpiece, Alonso Cano. Cano was actually more known as an architect. He was also a painter, he was a sculptor. His teacher was Pachenko, just as I mentioned, Velasquez. And he did the facade of the Granada Cathedral just before he died. He was said to have a very violent temper and not very well liked. In fact, this was a really horrible story I found out, that he came home one night. I mean, he was really temperamental. One time someone commissioned him to do a sculpture of a saint, and they were arguing the price, and he just shattered the sculpture. And people were like, you're not even supposed to do that. You could be hung for that. He didn't really care. And then he came home one evening, and his wife was murdered, and his home was robbed. And because he was such a temperamental guy, it was assumed that he did it. And he was put on trial, and they tortured him. And he would not confess because he didn't do it. So the king let him off, and he took holy orders after that because he went through quite of a hellish experience. So this is a masterpiece. It's Descent into Limbo. Jesus, after he comes off the crucifixion, he descends into hell to try to release these people who have been unfairly judged, and they're down to hell, and he's trying to bring them up because they've done nothing wrong. They've died for their beliefs. And so the colors are rich and beautiful. The exquisite nude bodies, they're just remarkable, very sculptural, and just this unusual palette. And then we have a bird, looks like it's almost upside down, peering into this window. So I do have to move on because I do tend to go a little more slowly. We just have about 10, 15 more minutes. And of course, we want to talk about one of the one of the amazing painters, and that is Francisco de Zurbarán. And we are going to look at one of our Timken magnificent masterpieces that is in the Timken. I will be showing you that momentarily, but let's just talk a little bit about Zurbarán. He's known primarily for his religious paintings. He depicted monks and nuns and martyrs. He did two of the most beautiful still lifes ever created. I'm going to show you that in just a second. They called him the Spanish Caravaggio because of his use of light. He excelled at using chiaroscuro and tenebrism. He did some large commissions for monasteries in Sevilla, where he spent a lot of his time. In 1630, he became also one of the painters of Philip IV, but he didn't live at court like Velasquez, but they were contemporaries. They knew each other. They worked together. They studied with the same artists. So he did move to Madrid in 1658. And at that time, he reconnected with Velasquez. All right. Oh, pardon me. I'm going to talk a little bit about this painting. All right. So this is quite a remarkable painting. Saint Seraphine, who was actually lived in between 1179 and 1240. And he was a Mercedarian, Our Lady of Holy Mercy, and he fought in the Third Crusade. And so if you look at this, he has a badge of the Crusades, the white cross and the red background, and he's being crucified. So he's in this very taut pose. These ropes are holding, stretching him out, and his head falls, and his cape almost seems to support him. And look at the anguish on his face. He's dead or dying. And the rope is so realistic. And look as the light falls on this magnificent garment. And it is quite a striking religious painting, but because of time, I'm going to just move on to a painting that's in the Prado, Agnus Dei, Lamb of God, but we also, this one happens to be in the San Diego Museum of Art. So we did more than one. And what is this? It comes from the gospel, John's gospel. John the Baptist describes Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And we have this detailed, beautiful lamb, Christ, as he's been sacrificed. Every curl, he's on a tabletop altar. Every curl is detailed. The flesh in between the fur, his eyes as they're sunken in death, and the twirling horns. He lies on a windowsill, and there's bright light sort of coming in. And so it is definitely a metaphor for Christ, the sacrificial lamb. All right. I want to talk to you about one of my favorite paintings in all of art, and it is in the Norton Simon Museum. And I have shown this in different lectures, but according to Peter Stendhal, may he rest in peace, he was a great art critic for the New Yorker magazine. And I remember reading his description of this painting, and he once said, in all of art history, particularly in the Baroque, where so many still lifes were painted, he felt that this was obviously the most remarkable. And I am so in love with this painting, not for a religious sense, but because it's so beautifully done. And I actually make a pilgrimage up to the Norton Simon, and actually throw in the Huntington as well, about every 6 months, because I just bask in the beauty of this painting. So it's the only signed and dated still life by Zurbarán. Zurbarán was a genius at still life painting. He didn't do many. His son also was a still life painter, but he didn't live very long. He died in his 20s. So Zurbarán was master of the school of Sevilla, and probably this is, as I say, one of the greatest still life paintings ever done. It has hyper-religious meaning. Look how equidistant these three set of objects are on this table, which functions as almost an altar. And what does it represent? It represents the Holy Trinity. And it also is an homage to the Virgin Mary. And this cup of water indicates her innocence, and the Immaculate Conception, because of the rose, is thornless. There's a rhythm and light to this painting. It's quiet, it's meditative. And again, it's sort of the verge of the earthly and spiritual. And you feel like you're almost looking on to the spiritual realm. But I very much hope, and look at the detail, the realism, as the light falls on the citron and the oranges. These are bulky lemons, and the sort of the arabesques of the leaves. It's just something beyond belief as far as I'm concerned. So let's look at the painting in our very own Timken collection. This is St. Francis in Meditation. And what is the skull? The memento mori, the momentum of death. And the Dutch and the Flemish painters were and also the Spanish and some Italian too, often put objects in their vanitas paintings. The vanitas paintings indicate a suggestion of the ephemeral nature of life. Well, this is not a still life painting. Obviously, we have St. Francis, who was part of a religious order, and he was a poet, he was a mystic, founder of the Franciscan sect. He loved animals, and he was in a mendicant order, which is order of poverty. And he is deep in prayer, and he holds the skull. And it's very dramatic contemplation. But what is the skull? The skull equals human mortality and the need for immediate conversion. Also, it could represent to Adam and mankind in general. All right. We have time, I think, to talk just briefly about another great painter and about one of the paintings in the Timken collection. We have a wonderful Spanish and Italian painting, and Dutch, Flemish, Baroque, and etc. But the Spanish paintings are just exquisite. So Bartolomeo Esteban Murillo was well known for his religious works, religious themes. He produced a number of genre paintings. You can see this is a genre painting. He liked to picture young people doing everyday things. There's this wistful charm. Some people thought his style was a little too charming and sweet, like this, and it kind of helped bring out less interest in Zurbarán's painting, which is a little unfortunate. But he definitely did elegant paintings, particularly of women and young people. There's a tenebrism and luminosity in his paintings. So here we have these young boys eating grapes and melon, and you see their tattered clothes and their dirty feet, and it really looks like a quote from Caravaggio's Bacchus, the grapes, clusters of grapes. And they look at each other and they're so happy to have a meal and the dirty feet. And as I said, and in Sevilla, as I mentioned earlier, there was this, when we look at one of the earlier paintings of Beckerboy, we see that there was a lot of poverty in Sevilla. It was ravaged by plague. There was a deep economic and social upheaval. And so, because remember, Spain's going through a lot of wars. It's not just, one and done. There's a lot going on in Spain, and they're losing their economic stature. And so we do see a lot of people in poverty. All right, we just have a couple more paintings, and we'll close in about 5 minutes. Here's two women at a window. And what we see is evidence of trompe l'oeil, fool the eye, and the French were so great at it. Look at many of the Rococo paintings, but the Dutch too, and later on the Americans. But this is trompe l'oeil. It looks like you can actually reach out and touch these young women. Murillo did a lot of religious themes, but he also did a lot of genre paintings. These are figures from contemporary life. You might have even seen these young women, and they're of the upper class. How do we know? Well, the clothing, even their kind of casual attire, but this is like a dueña, someone who would be sort of chaperone to the young woman. And she covers her mouth in piety. Maybe somebody has set them off with a funny movement, and they look, and it's a little impolite to guffaw and laugh. So she covers her mouth and in amusement. And we have just a really lovely incidents of a Spanish household and some behavior. And she pushes back the shutter and stares out. All right, just two more paintings. All right, so this is in our very own Timken collection, Christ on the Cross. And there's this dark, imposing kind of tenebrism in the background. And then we have the skull of Adam and Golgotha, and I'm mispronouncing, so sorry, where Christ was martyred. And in the background is Jerusalem, and we have the skull of Adam in a thigh bone. And then above we have Christ with a crown of thorns, and the light as it shines, he's looking up, which is very unusual because it's not that it wasn't done, but more often when you see Christ on the cross, you will see him looking down. So he's beseeching God, he's looking up in spiritual contemplation. And then we have in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, and that's up here. So we have Jerusalem in the background. And this is a magnificent painting. It's about 7 feet long. We have these skeletal remains here, and it's very propagandistic, very Counter Reformation, because I'm not Catholic, but if you look at something like that, and especially when you see it in all its magnificence at the Timken, it just kind of makes you see the beauty of the Catholic religion. All right, so we have time for just last, really, really quickly. This is Juan de Valdez, and this is Lille. And he was a very unique artist. He was known for somber, kind of macabre, dramatic light. And he did a lot of commissions, a lot of altarpieces, a lot of allegorical paintings, and he used a lot of exotic colors. He was actually Portuguese in ancestry, and eventually by the mid-century, the Spanish had lost control of Portugal. He was from Sevilla. As I mentioned, Sevilla is one of the more important cities. And he did study the work of Tintoretto and Titian, the great Venetian Renaissance painters. And he did look at some of the work of Murillo and other Madrid artists. But here is the sacrifice. Oh, so sorry. I guess we're going to just lastly talk about this painting, then we'll end because Sarah have some questions. Okay, so this is Sacrifice of Isaac. The painting embodies the High Baroque, and we see I hear some talking, so maybe I'll just stop here and see if there's any questions. And if there's a moment, we can go back and talk a little bit about the painting. But Sarah, do we have any questions so far? on Facebook or Zoom perhaps?
So yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat right now, but if anyone does have a question, then you can go ahead and put that in the chat and we can ask Karen.
Very happy to ask questions. Love when people make some nice observations, which most of you are able to do very easily. So please feel free.
We do have one question from Ryan who's asking, aside from the Zurbarán oranges, what is your favorite painting you covered today?
Oh, that's such a good question. I'm going to show it to you, if that's okay. I'm going to show this to you. And I think you might know that okay, this would be two. I think this is just unbelievable. But this one, let me show you. There's something about this just elegant, exquisite, inky blackness, the hyper detail. It's very high contrast. I love the sort of spirituality of it. And again, I'm very connected to still life painting. So I think this is it. And maybe you can share with the viewers what your favorite painting was. I'd be really curious, Ryan, if you could I'm so sorry, technologically, I'm not very good. Sarah and Scott have to do all this for me, but if Sarah gets an answer, you can let us know.
He says it's Las Meninas.
Oh, and you're very smart to say that. You're very smart to say that because it is probably considered the masterpiece of Spanish painting and one of the masterpieces of all of European Baroque. So you're in very good company seeing that. And I just want to make a really quick comment. I happened to be on vacation with my family and I was running into a bookstore and we didn't have much time and I had to grab a book and I just saw this book called Attribution. And it had a very kind of Spanish Baroque cover on it. And I purchased it because I knew it was about art. And I read it and it happened to be by a San Diego art historian who actually has a home in Hawaii where I was visiting. And it's fiction, but she's an art historian and she writes about the mystery surrounding a Velasquez. It's called Attribution. I would recommend it because it talks a lot about, it is fictionalized, but it talks a lot about art at the Prado, in Sevilla, some of these artists. And it's really quite an interesting fictionalized account of the Baroque. So I just wanted to throw that out there because it was very inspiring to me and of course also preparing for the lecture. But yes, Las Meninas, a remarkable work of art. Any other questions?
I don't see any, but maybe someone else is typing as we speak.
I'm going to go forward just really quickly.
All right. Well, it doesn't seem like we have any more questions. Did you want to present any more slides?
If you don't mind, I'll just take a minute to talk about this one because it's a vanitas. And I did mention how much I love still life. And this is really unique, but it does kind of harken back to more Dutch and Flemish still life paintings as opposed to the more really austere Cotán and Zurbarán. But this vanitas, so the vanitas was meant to symbolize the ephemeral nature of life. And they brought in objects that were memento mores. As I mentioned, those were objects that suggest death. A skull, a timepiece, the fleeting nature of time. A candle, life is short. But it also represents how earthly pleasures, these are crowns, these are religious crowns right here, and then crowns of the aristocracy. This is a navigation device, but look at these books. And what they're suggesting this painting, as the servant pulls back this beautiful work of art here, it's suggesting that in all these navigational pieces and the little angel blowing a bubble, of course, ephemeral nature, it just shows how the different types of still lifes, but this would be more seen in Flemish painting as opposed to the Dutch, as opposed to like Cotán and Zurbarán. Okay, so I will end there because I see we've gone over time. And I really appreciate all the viewers. Again, I will start again in January, the 4th Thursday in January with some new lectures, and I'm really excited about it. So hope you have a good holiday season, and I really would like to see you back in January 2025. Thank you both, Scott and Sarah, for all your help today.
Yeah,
And
thank you, Karen. We actually do, I looked on the schedule. We do have one more presentation in November on the 14th of November. But Karen won't be back until January.
I apologize. I don't mean to, because we do
No,
have
that's all right.
other wonderful lecturers too. Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you for bringing that up, Sarah.
Yeah, yeah. And then we just had some compliments in the chat, saying thank you for the clear explanations of the art history terms that we so commonly hear but aren't always explained so well. And they say your lectures are wonderful. And Ryan says that you should have a still life focused lecture. So maybe in the future you can plan to have one of those back in January or February.
Would love to. Absolutely love to.
All right. And yeah, looks like we're all good. So thank you, Karen, for the presentation today.
My
And
pleasure.
if anyone would like to view this lecture back or any other lectures, they are available to watch on our Facebook page 24/7. So thank you so much for joining us today. Have a nice day, and hopefully we'll see you back next time.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah.
Mhm.
And I'll be in touch, okay?